Welcome to the Manzil Ahmed channel. Um, Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome, brothers and sisters of faith. Today, I'm going to cover briefly my section one of my proposal in my book. I'm essentially just going to skim through it. Just from past videos, I've realized it's just better to just kind of just skim through it. Um, so So one of the big proposals I have is all employees who are or perform the role of a real estate agent, sales representative, cashier, or any role that involves the processing of a transaction or the sale of a product or service shall receive a commission not less than 1% of the value of the total transaction alongside base pay as per the terms and conditions of employment. So if you're like working, say, in like a retail store and you're responsible for a customer in one way or another, like purchasing something, whether it be like an actual item or an actual service, like servicing the car, for instance, you get a portion of that transaction value. So, so this is a much better proposal than just increasing the minimum wage because wages they go up and down based off of supply and demand, similar to groceries, goods, and services. So that doesn't really solve the problem. But what does make things fair is if you give a portion of the money that the company makes, it gives a portion of the money that it has profited as a result of that particular employee giving a particular service. That's a hell lot more fair, and that's how you're going to make sure that people are making enough money to go by and probably also to leave to have a decent life. And there's just like base pay, of course, but this would be like the more important payment, them getting paid for their work. um, so that's just one of the big things. um, and unlike the left, I don't believe in like full universal medical coverage, but I also don't believe that the government should be completely exempt from providing some kind of healthcare coverage. So, if you are an employee of any kind of company, um, you should have access to complete medical coverage, and there should not be any kind of discrimination. So, you should be able to get like top tier level doctors helping you. Um, so, this is just what my clause here is all about. And again, I'm not going to really read that whole thing word for word. So maybe I'll read this. So in my notes, this would serve a dual purpose of helping ordinary Americans as they would have better healthcare coverage and lower premiums and lift the financial burden. So the way I had it set up is instead of like employers giving you some kind of medical coverage, all of that, whatever services they're offering you, all of that will be subsidized by the government. So that takes the weight off their back, and they can reinvest the money that they would have invested in you into other things. Um, so, so better healthcare coverage and lower premiums and lift the financial burden of employers providing healthcare to employees, much like a tax cut, basically, and allow for more investment and increased GDP and reduce inflation by reducing operating cost. So if employers are not required to like um, pay certain things to their employees, that reduces their operating costs, and this will also incentivize them to hire more people instead of hiring people being more of a liability than something that they uh, get some value out of. And this is another thing too, like medicine in the United States is just pretty much capitalist. So medicine is one of those type of things. It should be focused on taking care of the person first and foremost. not about making the most cash possible and keep making a permanent patient by just giving them pills. That doesn't really solve their problem. It just kind of just makes sure that they just keep coming back to see you. Another thing I believe in is like mothers should be able to rest after giving birth, and that newborns are able to spend as much time as possible with their parents. It's also very inhuman to have someone working in a store or bank, for instance, to stand for 8 hours a day, especially if they're diabetic, when a chair can be provided. This is an established standard in Europe and most first world and third world countries. People, even from most developing third world countries, cannot even conceive of this kind of BS going on. And yeah, I just use a bunch of fancy words. It's really not that much inhumane. It's inhumane if the person's diabetic or if they have medical issues, but for most people, it's not really that inhumane. So I also talk about maternity leave, but I do add a bit of a twist here. So the twist here is they would get 3 months of paid maternity leave, but if there's a labor shortage, it becomes 1 month. And another twist here is like if the mother is not criminally responsible, like if in the case of if the child has like any untimely passing, they can still claim that maternity leave as long as she's not criminally responsible. And during that time, it's they get a paid leave, so they still get paid. Um, um, and by the way, it's at that point, it's just the government just subsidizing it. So they get so the employer is not like responsible. They're still getting their paycheck as normal, but it's the government that's subsidizing um, their pay. Um, and if there is no fixed salary, then the government will just kind of help with their day-to-day expenses. Yeah, and it has to be regular expenses, like it's not some kind of fancy shopping. So if it's like electric bills or things of that, or utilities, the government will, or mortgages, the government will kind of just finance that. Of course, and people might say like, oh, this big government, so much spending, but like we spend a ridiculous amount of money on military, ridiculous amount of money on just I mean, there are healthcare programs, but they're getting way more too much money. Um, like the money is not being used optimally, so there's a bit of fraud and stuff, and especially with what came out with USA, there's a whole bunch of fraud going on. um, yeah, so if that stuff wasn't a thing, then this stuff will obviously make sense. um, I also said another thing here is an employer may not fire a worker unless of a fault in his or her work or civil or criminal misconduct on the part of the employee, or this is a twist here. The chief executive officer or anyone or group or organization with equivalent powers or with controlling interest in the employer orders the termination and signs the termination letter. So usually if the CEO is involved, you probably messed up big time. So like if you're like in an engineering firm and you made a very bad decision that cost the company. So usually the CEOs are not involved, but and if they are, it's usually because of stuff like that. But if you're getting a letter from like the CEO, there's really no point in staying, even if you are able to fight the courts and still stay. It's sort of like if I start a company and I'm like the boss I'm like the one who runs the entire thing, and then I just simply just don't want to work with someone anymore. I should have that right to be able to be like, hey, I don't want to. I should have that right to be able to say that, hey, it's not working out. we can't have you here anymore. So best of luck. So so as an owner of a company, the owner has to have some basic level of authority. So you can't just take that away. And then I also talk about like payment insurance. So if there's like any kind of recession going on, uh, companies can still keep their workers, um, because the insurance companies will just pretty much pay their wages. Because what makes the recession even worse is like the companies lay off their workers, and then there's even less productivity. Um, yeah, so it's just bad all throughout. So any well, recession is like not even like the correct term. Like any kind of economic downturn, because a recession is when the price drops. So when price drops, there is like not as much demand. So you would actually want to be producing less. But like any kind of economic downturn, but even though for that time being it might make sense, but over the long haul, yeah, you don't want to be laying off people, because then once yeah, because you're digging the hole even deeper. Because once people can like start buying again, and like you can't produce the goods, that's not good. And actually, now that we talked about this, so recessions, what happens? Like the price goes down, there's not as much demand, there's probably too many goods, and a lot of it could also be recessions can also be caused by people like defaulting on their mortgages, or people just not having enough money to go out and buy goods. So by laying off workers, so if you just purely looked at it in the terms of supply and demand, then yeah, it will make sense to just like not produce as much and lay off workers. But that's not the whole picture. Part of it is also people just don't have the money to just go out and buy. Um, and by laying off workers, you only add more fuel to the fire. And as a company, you should always be producing something. And if you're not producing, you're not going to stay in business for very long. And I did add some parts about like being provided a chair and some nap time. I think this is customary in some places in Europe. I'm not 100% sure. Um, so for the time being, that particular area, like that particular business or department or area, shuts down. The only exception is if you're like working maybe like in an oil rig or any kind of like more hazardous type of job where the nature of the work doesn't allow for those type of accommodations, or in emergency situations. And also there should be no unfair treatment um, with regards to how people are treated in the workplace, or when practicing medicine. So like if you have like health insurance, for instance, you should not be getting bad quality doctors. You should be getting access to the best doctors that maybe a rich person could get access to. Like maybe not the richest person, but like relatively rich. Yeah. And yeah, anybody that didn't cross the border illegally, they should also have necessary and proper service if they suffer from disability. Um, any type of ER, emergency room care. Yeah. Any kind of emergency room care that should be backed by the government, because it's ridiculous that some emergency could happen and then now you're on the hook for a ridiculous amount of money. So this is just one of those instances where I feel like the government should do a good job of stepping up, because what ends up happening is a lot of people who do need emergency room care, they just won't go, which yeah, and that's absolutely unacceptable. Like one time my dad broke his nose, and then the bone was dislocated, and then it just kind of got stuck. It kind of solidified back into this new position. And what the doctor could have done is, like, if he went through ER, is just like kind of just like replace it back into its original position. It would have solidified back over there. But now that we finally got our appointment, and the guy said that he would have to break it again and then kind of put it back into its original position. So it's just stuff like that. Like, it's like, emergency is an emergency. So I would think that not only would you provide the service, but it would also kind of have the person financially covered too, because that's why we call it emergency, because the person's not in a state where they can just pay such an insane amount of money. And the way they bill people too is just also insane. Just even walking into the ER room and just start getting billed, that's just ridiculous. So all that kind of predatory practice would go away, because then they would be accountable to the government, and the government would be like, why are you charging us so much? So that kind of predatory practice would just go out the window. And the last but not least of this section is, medicines and vaccines shall be mass produced by private enterprises ethically. However, any pre-existing medicine or vaccine shall be subject to maximum price mandates by an appropriate federal agency. So, like, insulin, for instance, like, they overcharge on that. So that will no longer be the case. And the agency will be tasked with thoroughly researching the drug or vaccine's production costs and the supply and demand for and the affordability of the drug or vaccine by the American people, on which it shall base its decision. So that's about it. And you can just head over to our website. And when you click the Learn More button, you get access to a $1.5 million value. Because if you want to start your own movement, or if you're already a part of a movement, or if you just straight up just want to talk with your representative or senator, it's a very good idea to have a copy of this book in hand, because this would strengthen your cause big time. Because then you're not just a bunch of people. You're not a bunch of, like, people can't as easily call you a cult, or you won't be as disorganized, because once you have something like, hey, this is what we want, because now you can become like an organized force and be like, hey, these are our demands and these are the laws that we want. Because you shouldn't just blindly just trust your representative or senator to just like make all the decisions. No. There's that aspect of negotiation where you're like, hey, this is how we want the law to be written. Companies, what they do is they hire these people, like, called lobbyists, that pretty much do the exact same thing that I just did here. They write up the laws, and then the senators and representatives, they just go to Congress, and then they just kind of, there's some edits that are made typically, but it's mostly it's not too different. It's not far off from the original, and then it just gets passed. So as people, if you really want to participate in the the Democratic, the kind of the representative Republic process, you kind of have to um, have that same kind of mindset and operate with that same strategy, and be like, that's when that's when you truly start to exert your power as the people. Well, otherwise you're just a bunch of disorganized people just complaining about things. I don't want. The thing is, you can keep complaining, but when people start talking about the solution, that's when people become crickets. So yeah. So at the end of the day, you do want a solution, or otherwise you're just one of those type of people who just like complain for no reason. Not anything and everything that you do, there's always some reason to complain. But if you truly want to see something good happen, you need to have like some kind of like an established solution of like how you want to solve the problem. So it's a very good idea to get your hands on this if that's your intention.